The officer handed me a small white card with a case number scrawled in blue ink. My wife sat on the sofa with her face buried in her hands while the red and blue lights flashed against our living room walls. I closed the front door and locked the deadbolt because I knew what was coming next. My phone vibrated against the hardwood floor where I had dropped it moments ago. It was my mother-in-law calling for the 10th time in 3 minutes. I looked at Sarah and asked her if she was going to answer that. She shook her head and let out a sob that sounded more like a choke. I picked up the phone and silenced it before placing it on the kitchen counter face down. The silence in the house was heavy and suffocating like smoke before a fire. I walked into the kitchen and poured myself a glass of water because my mouth felt like sandpaper. Sarah finally looked up at me with eyes swollen from crying for the last hour. She asked me why I had two escalating things to the level of criminal charges. I stared at her in disbelief that she was still asking me that question. I reminded her that her father had not just borrowed the car, he had stolen it. She stood up and walked toward me, wiping her face with her sleeve. She said that he was family, and family helps each other out of jams. I slammed the glass down on the counter harder than I intended. I told her that selling my $40,000 vehicle to a stranger was not asking for help. It was a felony and he had planned it before he even asked for the keys. She flinched at the volume of my voice but did not back down. She said he was desperate because the alimony payments were going to send him to jail. I laughed a dry, humorless laugh that hurt my chest. I told her that now he was going to jail for grand theft auto instead. The logic of her argument was falling apart, but she refused to see it. We heard a car screech into our driveway and doors slamming shut. I walked to the window and saw her brother and her mother marching up the walkway. They looked like they were coming to burn the house down. I told Sarah that whatever happened next, she needed to stay out of the way. She begged me not to open the door, but I was not going to hide in my own home. I opened the door before they could pound on it and damage the wood. My mother-in-law pushed past me without even looking me in the eye. She went straight to Sarah and pulled her into a hug while glaring at me over her shoulder. Her brother stood in the doorway, with his fists clenched by his sides. He asked me if I felt like a big man putting his father behind bars. I told him to get out of my house, unless he had $40,000 in his pocket. He stepped forward into my personal space, attempting to intimidate me. He said that I was ruining his father's life over a material possession. I asked him if he knew that the car was not paid off yet. I asked him if he knew that the bank would come after me for the balance. He said that Dad would pay me back once he got back on his feet. I asked him how he planned to do that with a criminal record. My mother-in-law let go of Sarah and turned her venom toward me. She screamed that I was a heartless monster who never cared about this family. She said that her husband had treated me like a son since the day we met. I reminded her that a father does not steal from his son to pay his ex-wife. She gasped as if I had slapped her across the face. Sarah stepped between us and begged everyone to stop yelling. She looked at me and asked if we could just drop the charges for tonight. She said we could sort it out in the morning once everyone was calm. I looked at my wife and realized she was protecting them, not me. I told her that the police were already processing him at the station. There was no taking it back because he had already confessed to the officer. He told the cop to his face that he sold the car at a truck stop. He even showed them the cash he had left in his wallet. My brother-in-law punched the wall next to the door, leaving a dent in the drywall. He screamed that I had trapped him into confessing. I told him that his father was an adult who made a choice to commit a crime. My mother-in-law started crying loud, dramatic tears. She wailed about how he would not survive a night in a cell with his back condition. I felt absolutely zero sympathy for the man or his back condition. I told them that they needed to leave my property immediately. My brother-in-law laughed and said he was not going anywhere until I fixed this. I picked up my phone from the counter and held it up for him to see. I told him I was going to call the officer back and report a trespassing. He lunged for the phone, but I stepped back and he stumbled. Sarah screamed at him to stop before he did something stupid. He glared at me with pure hatred, but he backed off toward the door. My mother-in-law grabbed Sarah's hand and tried to pull her toward the exit. She told Sarah that she could not stay with a man who would do this to her father. I looked at Sarah waiting to see what she would do. She pulled her hand away from her mother and said she was staying. Her mother spit on my floor before turning and walking out the door. Her brother pointed a finger at me and said this was not over. They slammed the door so hard, the pictures on the wall rattled. The silence returned, but it was even worse than before. Sarah sank down onto the floor and leaned against the sofa. She looked up at the ceiling, with tears streaming down her face, into her ears. She asked me how we were going to come back from this. I told her that I did not know if we could. I walked into the garage and looked at the empty spot where my car used to be. There was an oil stain on the concrete where it had been parked just days ago. I remembered handing him the keys on Friday afternoon. He had smiled and shook my hand and thanked me for being generous. He said he just needed to drive upstate to see an old friend for the weekend. I felt a sick, twisting sensation in my stomach as I replayed that moment. He had been planning to rob me the entire time he was smiling in my face. I went back inside and saw Sarah on the phone speaking in hushed tones. She hung up quickly when she saw me enter the room. I asked her who she was talking to. She hesitated for a second too long before saying it was her sister. I knew she was lying, but I did not have the energy to fight about it. I sat down at the dining table and opened my laptop to check my accounts. I needed to find the loan documents and the insurance policy. I logged into the bank portal and stared at the outstanding balance. $38,000 still owed on the principal. I called the insurance claims line, even though it was late at night. The automated system put me on hold with terrible elevator music. Sarah walked into the kitchen and started making coffee. It was 11 at night, but neither of us was going to sleep. She placed a mug in front of me without saying a word. I nodded a thank you, but did not look up from the screen. The agent finally answered and I explained the situation clearly. I told him the vehicle was stolen by a family member who had permission to drive it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The agent explained that, because I gave him the keys, it might be a civil matter. My heart dropped into my stomach at those words. I argued that it was theft by conversion, and he had admitted to selling it. The agent said they would need the police report before they could move forward. He warned me that claims involving family were often denied. I hung up the phone and felt a cold sweat breaking out on my forehead. If the insurance denied the claim, I was on the hook for the entire loan. I would be paying $40,000 for a car a stranger was driving. I looked at Sarah and told her what the agent had said. She looked pale and asked if that meant we would have to pay it. I told her that yes, it meant we were financially ruined. She started crying again, saying she did not know he would sell it. I asked her if she knew he was in financial trouble. She looked down at her hands and nodded slowly. I felt the anger rising in my throat like bile. I asked her how much she knew about his situation. She admitted she knew he was behind on alimony for 3 months. She admitted he had asked her for money, but she said no. I stood up and paced around the kitchen island. I asked her why she let me loan him the car if she knew he was desperate. She said she thought he just needed to get to a job interview. I reminded her that he said he was visiting a friend. She admitted that was a lie they cooked up so I would not worry. I stopped pacing and stared at my wife as if she was a stranger. She had conspired with him to lie to me to get the car. She did not know he would sell it, but she helped him get the keys. I told her that she was an accomplice to the theft. She screamed that she was not, and that she was a victim too. I told her that she betrayed my trust just as much as he did. My phone rang again, breaking the tension in the room. It was an unknown number, but I answered it anyway. It was the detective from the local precinct returning my call. He asked me to confirm the vehicle identification number. I read the number off the screen of my laptop. He told me that they had located the person who bought the car. My heart leaped with a tiny bit of hope. He said the buyer was a guy running a scrapyard 2 towns over. The buyer claimed he bought it legitimately with a title. I told the detective that was impossible because the bank has the title. The detective said my father-in-law forged a duplicate title application. He had done it weeks ago, before he even asked to borrow the car. This was not a spur-of-the-moment desperation move. This was a calculated, premeditated fraud operation. I felt sick knowing he had been planning this while eating dinner at our table. The detective said they were impounding the car as evidence. However, the buyer had already started stripping parts off of it. The detective said the car was not drivable in its current state. I asked him if I could get it back. He said it would be held in evidence for the duration of the case. That could take months or even a year, depending on the courts. I thanked the detective and hung up the phone slowly. I relayed the information to Sarah, who was watching me intently. She covered her mouth in shock when I told her about the forged title. She said she could not believe he would go to those lengths. I told her that her father was a professional con artist. She did not try to defend him this time. She just sat there staring at the coffee mug with a blank expression. I told her that the car was wrecked and we were still paying for it. She asked if we could sue the buyer for the damages. I told her that was a question for a lawyer we could not afford. My phone buzzed again with a text message from her sister. It was a long paragraph accusing me of destroying the family. She said everyone knew I had money and could replace the car easily. I showed the text to Sarah and asked if this was true. Sarah read the message and shook her head. She said her sister was just emotional and did not mean it. I told her that her entire family seemed to think I was a walking ATM. I asked Sarah if she had been telling them we were rich. She admitted that she might have exaggerated our success to make them proud. I realized that my wife's need for approval had painted a target on my back. They thought stealing from me was just balancing the scales. I felt exhausted and defeated by the layers of deceit. I told Sarah that I was going to sleep in the guest room tonight. She started crying again and asked me not to leave her alone. I told her that I could not look at her right now without seeing him. I walked upstairs and shut the door to the guest room. I laid in bed staring at the darkness, listening to the house settle. My mind was racing, thinking about lawyers and courts and payments. I wondered if my marriage could survive the depths of this betrayal. I wondered if Sarah would eventually cave to her mother's pressure. I knew the morning would bring more calls and more harassment. I needed to be ready to fight, not just for my money, but for my sanity. I finally drifted into a restless sleep, filled with sirens and shouting. I woke up before the alarm to the sound of pounding on the front door. I checked my phone and saw it was 7 in the morning. I looked out the window and saw a beat-up sedan in the driveway. It was my father-in-law's younger brother, Uncle Mike. He was known for being the loudest and most aggressive of the bunch. I put on a robe and walked downstairs, passing Sarah's room. Her door was still closed, and I hoped she was asleep. I opened the front door, and Mike pushed past me into the foyer. He started yelling immediately about how I needed to drop the charges. He said he had talked to a lawyer buddy, and what I did was illegal. I asked him how reporting a theft could possibly be illegal. He said it was a civil dispute and using the police was malicious prosecution. I told him that his lawyer buddy was an idiot, or imaginary. Mike got in my face, and I could smell stale cigarettes and coffee. He told me that if I sent his brother to prison, I better watch my back. I pulled out my phone and started recording him. I asked him to repeat that threat for the camera. He swiped at my phone, but I pulled it away just in time. I told him to get out, or he would be joining his brother in a cell. He spat on the floor just like his sister had done the night before. He said I was a coward hiding behind the police. He stormed out and kicked a garden gnome on his way to the car. I locked the door and turned around to see Sarah standing on the stairs. She looked terrified and pale as a ghost. She asked me why Uncle Mike was here. I told her he came to deliver a threat on behalf of her father. She sat down on the stairs and put her head in her knees. She said she did not know her family was capable of this. I told her that money brings out the true colors of everyone. I went to the kitchen and started making breakfast because I was starving. It felt absurd to be cooking eggs while my life was imploding, but I needed routine to keep from screaming. Sarah came into the kitchen and sat at the island. She asked me what we were going to do about the car loan. I told her we would have to dip into our savings for a house. Her eyes widened and she said we could not touch that money. That money was for our future and our potential kids. I slammed the spatula down and told her there was no other choice. Unless she had $40,000 hidden somewhere, we had to pay the bank. She started crying again because that dream was now gone. Her father had not just stolen a car, he stole our down payment. He stole our future home, and he did not even care. I served her a plate of eggs, but neither of us ate. My phone rang and it was the detective again. I answered it on speaker so Sarah could hear everything. The detective said the arraignment was scheduled for 10 a.m. He asked if I wanted to be present for the bail hearing. I said absolutely I would be there. Sarah looked at me, panic in her eyes, and shook her head. She mouthed the words, "Please, don't go." I ignored her and told the detective I would see him there. I hung up and Sarah exploded. She said, looking him in the eye would only make things worse. She said it would humiliate him in front of the court. I told her that he humiliated himself when he became a thief. I told her she could stay home if she wanted, but I was going. I went upstairs to shower and dress in a suit. I wanted to look like the respectable victim that I was. When I came downstairs, Sarah was dressed in her work clothes. She said she was coming with me, but she was driving separately. I told her that was fine by me. We drove to the courthouse in silence in her car, because mine was gone. The parking lot was packed, but we found a spot near the back. As we walked toward the entrance, I saw the whole clan waiting. My mother-in-law, her sister, her brother, and Uncle Mike. They were standing in a tight circle smoking and plotting. They saw us approaching and turned like a pack of wolves. My mother-in-law rushed toward Sarah and hugged her aggressively. She whispered loudly that Sarah needed to stand by her father. She ignored me completely as if I was invisible. Uncle Mike glared at me from behind his sunglasses. We went through security and found the courtroom. We sat on the right side behind the prosecutor. The family sat on the left side behind the defense table. They brought in the prisoners in orange jumpsuits one by one. When my father-in-law walked in, he looked terrible. His gray hair was messed up and he looked older than his age. He scanned the crowd and locked eyes with his wife. She started sobbing loudly and the bailiff had to shush her. Then he saw me, and his expression changed to anger. He looked at Sarah and mouthed the words, "Help me." Sarah grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard it hurt. I pulled my hand away because I was not in the mood for comfort. The judge called his case, and the charges were read aloud. Grand theft auto, and forgery, and fraud. The prosecutor read the facts of the case quickly. He mentioned the confession and the sale of the vehicle. The defense attorney, a public defender, tried to argue for release. He said his client was a family man with strong ties to the community. He said this was a misunderstanding within the family. The judge looked over his glasses at the defense table. He asked if the victim was present in the courtroom. The prosecutor pointed to me and I stood up. The judge asked me if I considered this a misunderstanding. I cleared my throat and said, "No, Your Honor, it was theft." I said he forged documents and planned it for weeks. The family behind me gasped and someone hissed the word liar. The judge banged his gavel and demanded silence. He looked at my father-in-law and asked if he had anything to say. My father-in-law stood up shaking. He said he only borrowed it and was going to pay me back. He said he did not think his son-in-law would press charges. The judge asked him where the proceeds of the sale were. He said he paid his ex-wife and a few other debts. The judge shook his head, disgusted by the admission. He set bail at $50,000 cash. The family gasped again because they did not have that money. My mother-in-law let out a wail that echoed in the room. The judge ordered him remanded to custody until bail was posted. The bailiff handcuffed him again and led him away. He looked back at us with fear in his eyes. Sarah was crying silently beside me. We walked out of the courtroom into the hallway. The family surrounded us immediately, blocking our path. My mother-in-law screamed that I had just sentenced him to death. She demanded that I pay the bail money since I caused this. I looked at her like she was insane. I told her I would not pay a cent to get him out. Uncle Mike stepped up and said we need to talk outside. I told him we had nothing to talk about. Sarah finally spoke up and her voice was shaking. She told her mother to stop screaming at me. She said Dad did this to himself. The family went silent, looking at Sarah in betrayal. Her mother slapped Sarah across the face hard. The sound cracked through the hallway like a whip. I stepped between them and pushed the mother back. I told her if she touched my wife again, I would call the bailiff. She spat at me again, but missed this time. She told Sarah she was no longer her daughter. She said Sarah was dead to the family for siding with the enemy. They turned and walked away, leaving us standing there. Sarah held her cheek where a red mark was forming. I put my arm around her and guided her to the exit. We got to the car and she broke down completely. She sobbed that she had lost her entire family in one day. I told her she still had me, but I knew it was not enough. We drove home in a daze. When we pulled into the driveway, I saw something on the porch. It was a brick with a note taped to it. I got out and walked up to inspect it. The note said, "You will pay for this," in scribbled marker. I picked up the brick and showed it to Sarah. She looked at it with dull, lifeless eyes. I told her we needed to install security cameras immediately. I called the police again to report the threat and the assault. An officer came by an hour later to take another report. It felt like we were living in a war zone, not a suburb. Later that afternoon, I got a call from the bank. They had been notified of the impound by the police. They were calling the entire loan due immediately. Because the collateral was compromised, they wanted the full amount. I tried to explain that I would keep making payments. The manager said it was bank policy in cases of fraud and theft. I had 30 days to pay the $38,000, or they would sue me and garnish my wages. I hung up the phone and felt the walls closing in. I walked into the living room, where Sarah was staring at the TV. I told her about the bank calling the loan. She did not even react, she just blinked. I told her I was going to the bank to transfer the house funds. She nodded slowly and said, "Do whatever you have to do." I drove to the bank feeling a deep sense of loss. I watched the teller transfer the money out of our savings. 5 years of saving for a house gone in 5 minutes. I got a cashier's check made out to the auto lender. I mailed it at the post office with a heavy heart. I came home and found Sarah packing a suitcase. My heart stopped and I asked her what she was doing. She said she needed some time apart to process everything. She said being in this house felt like being in a prison. I asked her where she was going to go. She said she was going to stay with a friend from work. I asked her if she was leaving me because of her father. She said she was leaving because everything was broken. She said she could not look at me without feeling guilt, and she could not look at me without seeing the man who jailed her dad. I told her that was unfair, and she knew it. She zipped up the suitcase and walked to the door. She said unfair or not, it was how she felt. I stood in the driveway and watched her drive away. I was alone in the house with an empty garage and an empty savings account. My phone buzzed with a text from my mother-in-law. It was a picture of my father-in-law in his jail cell. The caption read, "Hope you are happy." I deleted the text and blocked the number. I went into the kitchen and poured a drink. I sat in the dark and wondered if I did the right thing. I saved my credit score, but I lost my wife and my safety. The house was quiet, but my mind was screaming. I knew the morning would bring more legal battles. I knew the family would not stop harassing me. But for now, I just sat there in the wreckage of my life. I wondered if Sarah would ever come back. I wondered if I even wanted her to come back. She had lied to me and enabled him until it was too late. Maybe we were broken long before he stole the car. The moral dilemma was eating me alive. Was justice worth destroying everything I built? Should I have just eaten the loss and saved the family? I looked at the empty ring on the table where she left it. I picked it up and felt the cold metal in my hand. The phone rang again. It was the jail collect call service. He was calling me from inside, to beg or threaten. I stared at the phone ringing and ringing. I reached out and pressed the accept button. I wanted to hear what he had to say. His voice came through tinny and distant. He said, "Listen to me, son. You need to fix this." I took a deep breath and prepared to end it once and for all. I told him I was not his son, and I told him I was not going to fix anything. I hung up the phone and unplugged it from the wall. I was done being the victim. Tomorrow I would call a divorce lawyer. Tomorrow I would file a restraining order against the whole family. But tonight I just sat in the dark and listened to the silence.